During his daily walk, a millionaire decides to explore a new route. In the middle of the busy street, a discreet touch makes your heart race. He turns around and sees a street girl holding her wallet with shaking hands. But what he discovers about her completely changes his outlook on life. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Tell us which city you're watching us from, and we'll keep going. The afternoon sun painted the city sky in golden hues as Jean set out for his daily walk. At 45, he was the antithesis of what one would expect of a millionaire. He dressed simply, walked the streets without security, and greeted local merchants by name. His serene face and attentive eyes contrasted with the frenetic pace of the metropolis. That Thursday afternoon, Jean decided to take a different route. He turned left onto Avenida Paulista, entering a less busy street. The aroma of fresh bread drew him to a corner bakery, where he bought a still warm cheese bread. As he savored his snack, he watched the people coming and going, each immersed in their own world. It was then that he felt it, a slight tug on his waist, almost imperceptible. Jean looked down and was met with a pair of wide brown eyes. A girl, no more than 12 years old, was holding her wallet with trembling hands. Her dark hair was tangled, and her worn clothes betrayed her precarious situation. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The girl, realizing she had been caught, froze. Jean could have screamed, called the police, or simply snatched the wallet from her hands. But something in the girl's frightened gaze touched him deeply. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice soft. The question took the girl by surprise. She blinked several times, as if trying to understand if it was real. After a few seconds of hesitation, she nodded slightly. "What's your name?" Jean continued, keeping his tone gentle. "Luluma," she stammered, still clutching her wallet. Jean smiled, extending his hand. "Nice to meet you, Luma. I'm Jean. How about we return this," he gestured to the wallet, "and go get something to eat? I know a great place nearby." Luma looked at the wallet and then at Jean, the distrust evident in her eyes. Slowly, she handed the object back, ready to run in case it was a trap. But Jean just put the wallet in his pocket and gestured invitingly towards the bakery. "Come on, choose whatever you want," he said, opening the door to the establishment. The aroma of freshly baked bread and cakes enveloped Luma, making her stomach growl audibly. She hesitantly entered, looking around as if she were in a completely new world. Jean ordered 2 pieces of toasted bread and 2 orange juices. While they waited, he watched Luma discreetly. The girl kept moving, her eyes darting from side to side as if she were looking for an escape route. When the food arrived, Luma devoured the bread in seconds, as if she was afraid someone might take it away from her at any moment. Jean ate hers slowly, giving her time to feel more comfortable. "How long have you been on the street, Luma?" asked gently. The girl swallowed hesitantly. "It's been a while," she replied vaguely. Jean nodded, understanding that it wouldn't be easy to gain his trust. "I see. And where have you been sleeping?" Luma looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "Around there," she muttered. The silence that followed was heavy. Jean knew he couldn't simply ignore the child's situation. But he also understood that offering help to a stranger could be complicated. However, something about that girl intrigued him, as if an invisible force was pushing him to do something. "Luma," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I know you don't know me, and I understand if you don't trust me, but I can't in good conscience let you go back to the streets. How about spending the night at my place? It's just for today. And tomorrow we can figure out a better solution. I promise you'll be safe." Luma's eyes widened at the unexpected offer. She was silent for a long moment, clearly torn between distrust and the prospect of a roof over her head. I don't know," she finally replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Jean smiled gently. "All right. No need to decide now. How about we take a walk? You can get to know me a little better, and if you feel confident, we'll accept the offer. If not, I completely understand." Luma nodded slowly, still cautious, but with a hint of curiosity in her eyes. As they left the bakery, Jean felt a strange mix of emotions. Concern for the girl's situation, intrigue about her story, and an inexplicable feeling that this encounter would change her life forever. What John didn't know was that that simple decision to help a street child would set off a chain of events that would reveal long-buried secrets, test family bonds, and redefine the meaning of redemption and belonging. As they walked side by side through the city streets, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the city. It was the beginning of a journey neither of them could have foreseen, but one that was destined to transform their lives in profound and irreversible ways. Dusk was tinging the city sky when John and Luma arrived at his house, a discreet two-story house in a quiet neighborhood in the South Zone. The simple facade contrasted with what one might expect from a millionaire's residence, but it perfectly reflected Jean's personality. Upon opening the door, they were greeted by the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Mrs. Laura, Jean's mother, a 70-year-old woman with grey hair and discerning eyes, was sitting in her favorite chair in the living room, leafing through a magazine. "Jean, my son, you took your time today," she commented, looking up. Her gaze quickly settled on Luma, who had shrunk slightly behind Jean. "And who is this girl?" Jean took a deep breath, preparing to explain the unusual situation. "Mom, this is Luma. She needs our help for tonight." Mrs. Laura frowned, her eyes scanning Luma up and down. The girl, feeling exposed, dropped her gaze to the ground. "Jean, can we talk in the kitchen for a moment?" Mrs. Laura asked, her voice calm but firm. As mother and son headed toward the kitchen, Luma stood in the middle of the room, her eyes roaming around the room. The decor was cozy, with dark wood furniture and family photographs on the walls. A grand piano sat in one corner of the room, its keys glowing in the soft light of the lamps. In the kitchen, Mrs. Laura stared at June with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Son, what are you thinking? Bringing a street girl home just like that?" Jean sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't leave her on the street. It's just for one night. Tomorrow we'll look for a more suitable solution." Mrs. Laura shook her head, but her eyes softened. "You have such a good heart, Jean, just like your father." She paused, as if remembering something distant. "Okay, she can stay, but we need to sort this out tomorrow." When they returned to the living room, they found Luma exactly where they had left her, looking small and out of place amidst the simple elegance of the house. "Well, Luma," Jean said, trying to sound cheerful, "how about a hot bath and clean clothes? Then we can all have dinner together." The girl nodded shyly, following Jean upstairs. He led her to a guest room, showing her where the towels were kept and providing her with some of his niece's old clothes that he still had. "Take all the time you need," Jean said gently. "We'll be downstairs when you're ready." Alone in her room, Luma looked around with a mixture of fascination and distrust. The soft mattress, the clean sheets, the hot shower, it all seemed too surreal to be true. As the water ran down her body, washing away the dirt from the streets, Luma couldn't help but feel like she was living a dream from which she would soon wake up. Downstairs, Jean and Mrs. Laura prepared dinner in a silence filled with unresolved tension. It was Mrs. Laura who finally broke the silence. "Jean, have you ever stopped to think about the implications of this? What if she has family looking for her? What if—" "Mom," Jean interrupted her gently, "I know there are risks, but I also know that I wouldn't be able to look at myself in the mirror if I had left that girl on the street. Tomorrow, we will go to the Child Protection Service. We will do everything the right way." Mrs. Laura nodded, resigned. "You've always been like this ever since you were a child, always wanting to fix the world." At that moment, hesitant footsteps on the stairs announced Luma's arrival. She appeared in the kitchen, doorway almost unrecognizable. Her wet hair framed a clean face that revealed delicate features and large, expressive eyes. The borrowed clothes, although a little large, gave her an air of normality that contrasted drastically with her previous appearance. "Come, dear," Mrs. Laura said, her voice softer now. "Dinner is almost ready." As they sat at the table, an uncomfortable silence hung over them. Jean, trying to ease the tension, began asking light questions about Luma's preferences, her favorite food, whether she liked to study, what her hobbies were. The girl's answers were short, but gradually she began to relax a little. It was when Jean mentioned music that Luma's eyes truly lit up for the first time. "Do you like music?" he asked, noticing the change in her expression. Luma nodded enthusiastically. "My mother, she used to sing to me," she said, her voice low but full of emotion. John exchanged a meaningful look with Mrs. Laura. It was the first time Luma had mentioned her family. "You know," John said casually, "that piano in the living room was my father's. He loved to play. Maybe after dinner I could play a little for you. What do you think?" The shy smile that formed on Luma's face was answer enough. After the meal, they went to the living room. Jean sat at the piano, his fingers gliding gently across the keys in a soft, melancholic melody. Luma approached, fascinated, her eyes fixed on the movements of Jean's hands. As the music filled the room, Mrs. Laura watched the scene with mixed emotions. There was something in the way Luma looked at the piano, something in her features that awakened a distant memory. In Mrs. Laura, a memory she could not fully define. The night wore on, and it soon became clear that Luma was exhausted. Jean led her back to the guest room, assuring her that she would be safe and that they could talk more in the morning. When Jean returned to the room, he found his mother still sitting, looking thoughtful. "What are you thinking about, Mom?" he asked, sitting down next to her. Mrs. Laura hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm not sure, son. There's something about this girl, something familiar. I can't explain it." Jean nodded, understanding the feeling. He also felt an inexplicable connection with Luma, as if fate had orchestrated their meeting. "We'll find out more tomorrow," he said, kissing his mother on the forehead before retreating to his own room. That night, as the house fell silent, each of its occupants was lost in their own thoughts. Luma, lying in her soft bed, fought the fear that this was all just a cruel dream. Jean pondered the changes a single act of kindness could trigger, and Mrs. Laura, in her room, leafed through an old photo album, her eyes fixed on one particular image, a nagging doubt beginning to form in her mind. What none of them knew was that the events of that day were just the beginning of a journey that would unearth long-buried secrets, test family bonds, and redefine the meaning of family for them all. Dawn brought with it an air of anticipation. Jean woke early, his thoughts immediately turning to the little girl sleeping in the guest room. He crept downstairs quietly, surprised to find his mother already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Mom," he said, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. "Didn't you sleep well?" Mrs. Laura sighed, absently stirring a cup of tea. "Not much, son. I was thinking about the girl and other things." Jean was about to ask more when they heard hesitant footsteps on the stairs. Luma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair disheveled and her eyes still sleepy. For a moment she looked confused, as if she didn't remember where she was. "Good morning, Luma," Jan smiled, trying to put her at ease. "Did you sleep well?" The girl nodded shyly, her eyes darting around the kitchen until they landed on the table, where a hearty breakfast was laid out. Her stomach growled audibly, making her blush. "Come, dear," Mrs. Laura said, pulling up a chair. "Eat as much as you like." As Luma served herself, Jean and her mother exchanged glances. There was something in the way the girl moved, in the way her eyes sparkled when she saw the food, that touched them both deeply. "Luma," Jean began softly after a few minutes, "today we need to go to the Child Protective Services. They can help us find your family or a safe place for you to stay." Luma's fork paused in mid-air, her eyes widening in fear. I can't go home," she whispered. "Why not, dear?" Mrs. Laura asked, her voice gentle. Luma looked down, playing with the food on her plate. "There's no one there," she finally replied, her voice barely audible. The silence that followed was heavy. Jean felt his heart tighten, imagining what that child had already gone through. "Oh, okay," he said finally. "We won't do anything you don't want, but we need to find a solution, Luma. You can't stay on the streets." The girl nodded slowly, still without looking up. At that moment, the doorbell rang, surprising everyone. Jean went to answer it, returning a few minutes later with a worried expression. "It was Clara," he explained to his mother. "She said she'll be coming in later for her shift." Mrs. Laura nodded, remembering that it was the day for the caregiver to come and help her. With all the excitement of the previous night, she had completely forgotten. "Who is Clara?" Luma asked, her curiosity momentarily overcoming her fear. "She's my caregiver," Mrs. Laura explained. "She comes a few times a week to help me with the housework and keep me company." Luma seemed to process the information, her eyes roaming around the spotless kitchen. "But you seem so capable," she commented hesitantly. Mrs. Laura laughed softly. "Oh, I still am most of the time. But sometimes age takes its toll, you know. It's nice to have someone around, especially when Jean is at work." The mention of work seemed to spark something in Jean. He glanced at his watch, frowning. "Speaking of which, I should be in the office right now, but I can't leave you guys." "Go to work, son," Mrs. Laura interrupted him. "Luma and I will be fine, won't we, dear?" Luma nodded, though a shadow of apprehension crossed her face. John hesitated, torn between his responsibilities and the unusual situation at home. Finally, he decided that a day away from the office wouldn't cause too much trouble. "I'll make a few calls and work from home today," he announced. The morning passed surprisingly smoothly. Jean settled into her upstairs office, alternating between work-related phone calls and researching legal procedures for helping homeless children. Meanwhile, in the living room, Mrs. Laura decided to teach Luma to knit. The girl, initially clumsy with needles, soon got the hang of it, her nimble fingers working the wool with increasing confidence. It was during this activity that Mrs. Laura began asking gentle questions, trying to find out more about Luma's past. "You mentioned your mother yesterday," she commented casually. "She liked music, didn't she?" Luma nodded, a sad smile playing on her lips. "She sang all the time. She said music was the language of the soul." "And your father?" Mrs. Laura asked kindly. Luma's face instantly fell. "I never met him," she muttered. Before Mrs. Laura could ask any more questions, the doorbell rang again. It was Clara arriving for her shift. The caregiver, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stopped abruptly when she saw Luma. For a moment, a strange expression crossed her face: surprise, recognition, even fear. But it happened so quickly that Mrs. Laura thought she had imagined. "Hello, Mrs. Laura," Clara greeted, her eyes still fixed on Luma. "And who is this young lady?" Introductions were made, and Clara began her usual duties, but Mrs. Laura noticed that she seemed distracted, casting frequent glances at Luma. In the afternoon, while Luma was napping on the couch, exhausted after a morning of activities she was not used to, Mrs. Laura called Jean into the kitchen. "Son," she began, her voice low, "there's something strange going on." The way Clara looked at Luma, it's like she knows her from somewhere. Jean frowned thoughtfully. "Do you think we should ask her?" Before Mrs. Laura could respond, a sharp scream came from the living room. Rushing in, they found Luma sitting on the couch, trembling and wide-eyed in fear. "What's wrong?" Jean asked, kneeling down beside her. I saw someone," Luma stammered. "At the window. Someone was watching me." Jean ran to the window, but the street was empty and calm as always. When he returned, he found Clara trying to calm Luma, but the girl kept moving away from her as if she felt something was wrong. The rest of the afternoon passed in a tense atmosphere. Luma refused to be alone, and Clara seemed increasingly nervous. At night, after Clara had left and Luma was safely in bed, Jean and Mrs. Laura gathered in the living room, their voices low and worried. "There's something not right," Jean murmured. Luma's reaction, Clara's behavior, it's like there are pieces of a puzzle we can't see. Mrs. Laura nodded, her face etched with worry. "John, I think we need to investigate further. About Luma's past, about Clara. I have a feeling we're on the verge of discovering something important." Meanwhile, in the guest room, Luma was far from asleep. Her eyes scanned the shadows, fearing that she would see the figure that had haunted her again. In her mind, long-suppressed memories began to emerge, bringing with them a fear she did not fully understand. The night progressed, and with it, the feeling that the secrets buried in the past were about to come to light, ready to shake the foundations of everyone's lives in that house. The next day dawned cloudy, as if the sky reflected the tense atmosphere. Jean, who had barely slept, was sitting at the kitchen table, an untouched cup of coffee in front of him. His mind went over the events of the previous day, trying to make sense of Luma's reactions and Clara's strange behavior. Mrs. Laura came into the kitchen, her face showing signs of a bad night's sleep. "Jean," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking all night. There's something I need to show you." Intrigued, Jean followed his mother to her room. There, Mrs. Laura opened a drawer and took out an old photo album, yellowed with age. With trembling hands, she flipped through it until she reached a specific page. "Look," she said, pointing to a photograph. Jean leaned in to get a better look. The photo showed his father, much younger, standing next to a woman he didn't recognize. She was beautiful, with long dark hair and a radiant smile. But what really caught Jean's attention was the undeniable resemblance between the woman in the photo and Luma. "Who is she, Mother?" Jean asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Laura sighed deeply. "Her name was Rosanna. She worked here at home for a while, many years ago. She was very close to your father." The implications of that sentence hung heavily in the air. Jean felt as if the ground had disappeared from beneath her feet. "Mother, are you suggesting that—" Before he could finish his sentence, they were interrupted by a scream coming from the guest room. They rushed there, finding Luma sitting on the bed, panting and with her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong, dear?" Mrs. Laura asked, sitting down next to the girl. I remembered," Luma stammered between sobs. "My mother. She talked about this house. She said that one day we would return here, that it was our place." Jean and Mrs. Laura exchanged meaningful glances. The situation was becoming more complex by the moment. "Luma," Jean said softly, "do you remember your mother's name?" The girl nodded slowly. "Rosanna," she whispered. "Her name was Rosanna." The silence that followed was deafening. Jean felt as if the entire world had stopped spinning. All the pieces of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place, forming a picture he wasn't sure he was ready to see. At that moment, the doorbell rang, breaking the tension of the moment. Jean went downstairs, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. When he opened the door, he found Clara, looking nervous and agitated. "Mr. Jean," she began, her voice shaking, "I need to talk to you. It's about Luma." Jean led her to the living room where Mrs. Laura and Luma were already there. Upon seeing the girl, Clara visibly paled. "What do you know about Luma, Clara?" Jean asked, trying to remain calm. Clara took a deep breath as if gathering her courage. I met her mother, Rosanna. She came to me a few years ago asking for help." Luma, who had remained silent until then, approached Clara, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Did you know my mother? Where is she? Why did she leave me?" Clara looked at the girl, tears forming in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Luma. Your mother, she was in trouble. She wanted to run away with you, but she was afraid. She asked me to help her, but I refused. I was afraid of losing my job, of getting into trouble." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with unspoken emotions and shocking revelations. Jean felt a growing anger, not only directed at Clara, but at the entire system that allowed this situation to reach this point. "Why didn't you say anything before?" he asked, his voice strained. Clara lowered her head, ashamed. "I tried to forget, to pretend it had never happened. But when I saw Luma here, all the memories came back. I couldn't keep this secret any longer." Luma, who had been listening in silence, suddenly stood up. Her eyes, previously filled with fear, now shone with fierce determination. "I want to know everything," she declared. "About my mother, about what happened. I don't want any more secrets." Jean looked at the girl, admiring her courage. He knew that what came next would not be easy, but it was necessary. The truth, no matter how painful it was, had to come out. "It's okay, Luma," he said, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out together, everything." At that moment, as the group prepared to unearth long-buried secrets, the distant sound of thunder echoed, as if the sky itself recognized the emotional storm that was about to unfold in that house. Mrs. Laura, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "There is much I need to tell you all, about the past, about your father, Jean, and about Rosanna." As the storm gathered outside, inside the house, another storm, long pent up, was about to be released. Secrets would be revealed, bonds would be tested, and lives would be irrevocably changed. The chapter in the life of that unlikely family was just beginning to be written, and no one could have predicted the end of this story that mixed past and present, love and betrayal, redemption and forgiveness. The rain began to fall slowly outside, heavy drops beating against the windows of the house. Inside, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Everyone gathered in the living room, anxious gazes fixed on Mrs. Laura, who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. "There is so much to tell," Mrs. Laura began, her voice shaking. "Things I've tried to forget for years, things I thought would never have to come to light." Jean leaned forward, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Mom, please, we need to know the truth." Mrs. Laura nodded slowly, her eyes turning to Luma, who was sitting stiffly on the sofa, her large dark eyes filled with apprehension. "It all started about 15 years ago," Mrs. Laura began her narrative. "Your father, Jun, was at the height of his career. We were rich, respected, we had everything. Or so I thought." She paused, as if gathering the courage to continue. "That's when Rosanna came into our lives. She was hired as a housekeeper, but she soon became so much more than that. Her father, he fell in love with her." Jean felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The image he had of his father, an upright and faithful man, began to shatter before his eyes. "At first I pretended not to see," Mrs. Laura continued. "I thought it was just a phase, that it would soon pass. But then Rosanna got pregnant." Everyone's eyes turned to Luma, who seemed to have stopped breathing. "Your father panicked," Mrs. Laura said, her voice now a mere whisper. He offered Rosanna money to make her disappear so no one would know. But she refused. She wanted him to take the child, to start a family no matter how unconventional." Jean stood up abruptly, unable to contain his agitation. "And what happened next?" Mrs. Laura closed her eyes as if the memory was too painful. I did something terrible, something I deeply regret to this day. I threatened Rosanna. I told her that if she didn't leave, I would make sure she never saw the child again." Luma let out a muffled sob, tears silently streaming down her face. "Rosanna left that very night," Mrs. Laura continued, her voice cracking. "She left a letter for her father, Jean, a letter that I hid. In it, she said that she would return one day, that she would find a way to prove that the child was his, that she would fight for what was rightfully hers." The silence that followed was deafening. June felt as if the entire world had collapsed around him. His gaze wandered from his mother to Luma, the girl he now knew to be his half-sister. Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Why did you do this? Why did you hide all of this from me?" Mrs. Laura sobbed, tears now streaming freely down her wrinkled face. "We wanted to protect you, protect our family. Your father, he wasn't the man everyone thought he was. There were problems, debts, shady dealings. Rosanna knew too much. If the truth came out..." Clara, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "That's why Rosanna came to me. Years later, she wanted proof, she wanted justice, but I was afraid of losing my job, afraid of the consequences." Luma, who had been quiet throughout the revelation, suddenly stood up. Her eyes, though filled with tears, shone with fierce determination. "Where is my mother now? Did she abandon me?" Everyone's hearts in the room seemed to sink at the girl's question. Mrs. Laura approached her hesitantly. "No, dear, your mother never abandoned you. She tried to come back for you, but what?" Luma demanded, her voice shaking. Jean intervened, his voice gentle but firm. "Luma, I promise you that we will find out what happened to your mother. I will not rest until we know the whole truth." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to underline the gravity of the situation, a loud thunder shook the house, making everyone jump. "There's more," Mrs. Laura said, her voice barely audible. There's a will. Your father left a considerable portion of the inheritance to Rosanna and to you, Luma. But I hid it. I thought I was protecting our family, but now I see that I only caused more pain." Jean felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His entire life, everything he thought he knew about his family, was crumbling before his eyes. "We need to fix this," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "We need to do what's right. For Luma, for Rosanna, for all of us." Luma looked at Jean, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. You'll help me find my mother." Jean knelt before her, taking her small hands in his. "Luma, I promise you that we will do everything in our power to find your mother and find out the whole truth. You are not alone anymore. You are part of this family now, no matter what." As the storm raged inside the house, a new reality began to form. Secrets had been revealed, painful truths exposed, but there was also hope. Hope for redemption, for healing, for a new chance for everyone. Night fell over the city, and with it, the promise of a new dawn. A dawn that would bring challenges, but also the possibility of a new beginning for this newly discovered family, and the secrets that were yet to come to light. The storm brewing outside seemed to mirror the emotional turmoil inside the house. Everyone gathered in the living room, the tension palpable in the air. Mrs. Laura, sitting in her favorite chair, seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. Jean stood restlessly, while Luma huddled on the couch, her eyes flickering between the adults in the room. "I think it's time to tell the whole truth," Mrs. Laura began, her voice shaking. "It all started over 20 years ago." And so Rosanna's story began to unfold. She had arrived at the house as a young maid, full of dreams and hopes. Jean's father, a successful businessman, was quickly enchanted by her. What began as a forbidden attraction soon turned into a torrid affair. "I knew," Mrs. Laura admitted, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "I always knew, but I chose to close my eyes. It was easier to pretend it wasn't happening." Jean listened in shock, the image he had of his father crumbling with every word. "Why didn't you ever tell me, Mom?" he asked, his voice cracking. "To protect you, son, and I admit to protect myself as well. The shame, the fear of scandal. It was too much to bear." Luma, who had been listening in silence until then, finally spoke. "And my mother? What happened to her?" Mrs. Laura took a deep breath before continuing. "Rosanna got pregnant. Her father, he panicked. He offered her money to leave, to disappear, but Rosanna refused. She wanted him to take care of the child, to take care of both of you." The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Jean staggered, leaning against the wall to keep from falling. Luma, for her part, looked as if she had been struck by lightning, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. So Jean is mine." Luma couldn't finish the sentence. The words stuck in her throat. "Tu aussi t'as de caisse, brother," Jean finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm your brother." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara, who had remained silent until then, was silently sobbing in a corner of the room. "But that doesn't explain why my mother abandoned me," Luma said, her voice thick with hurt. It was then that Clara finally spoke. "She didn't abandon you, Luma. Rosanna fought with all her strength to stay with you, but things got complicated." Clara then revealed that years after Luma's birth, Rosanna had returned, desperate for help. Jean's father, fearing that the scandal would come to light, had used his influence to threaten her. Rosanna was determined to run away with Luma, but she needed help. "I was a coward," Clara admitted, tears streaming freely down her face. "I could have helped, but I was afraid. When I saw you here, Luma, it was as if all my sins had come back to haunt me." Jean, who had remained silent until then, processing all the revelations, finally spoke. "Where is Rosanna now? Is she still alive?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded with implications. No one in the room seemed to have the answer. Luma, her voice shaky but determined, said, "We need to find her. She has to be somewhere." At that moment, as if fate wanted to add another layer of complexity to the situation, the doorbell rang again. Jean, still stunned by all the revelations, went to answer it. In the doorway, soaked from the rain that was now pouring down, stood a middle-aged man, his eyes tired but determined. "My name is Alex," he said. "I'm a private investigator. I was hired years ago to find Rosanna and Luma." The shock, in the room was palpable. Who would have hired an investigator? Why? And what did he know about Rosanna's whereabouts? As Alex was ushered in, carrying with him a thick folder of documents, it was clear that the story was far from over. New revelations were about to come to light, ready to further shake the foundations of this newly discovered family. The storm outside raged, mirroring the swirling emotions inside the house. Secrets buried for decades were being unearthed, and the consequences of those revelations were only just beginning to unfold. Jean looked at Luma, his newfound sister, and saw in her a mixture of fear and hope. He knew that no matter what came next, his life would never be the same. And somewhere, deep in his heart, he made a silent promise to protect Luma and find the truth no matter the cost. The room fell silent as Alex prepared to share his findings. The next chapter in this family saga was about to begin, and no one knew for sure what the future held. The sound of rain hitting the windows created a somber atmosphere in the living room, where all eyes were fixed on Alex, the private investigator who had just arrived. He placed his soaked briefcase on the coffee table and looked around, his face tired but determined. "I know my presence here is unexpected," Alex began, his voice hoarse, "but I believe the information I have is crucial to all of you." Jean, still stunned by the previous revelations, was the first to speak. "Who hired you, and what exactly do you know about Rosanna and Luma?" Alex took a deep breath before answering. "I was hired by Mr. Antonio, your father, Jean, shortly before his death." A stunned silence fell over the room. Mrs. Laura put her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. "My father?" Jean asked in disbelief. "But why?" "Remorse," Alex answered simply. "In his final days, your father was consumed by guilt. He wanted to make peace with the past, to right his wrongs. He hired me to find Rosanna and Luma, to try to fix what he had broken." Luma, who had remained silent until then, approached Alex, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and fear. You found my mother?" Alex looked at the girl with compassion. "Yes and no, Luma. I found traces of her, but the story is complicated." He opened his briefcase, pulling out a series of documents and photographs. "Rosanna spent years trying to get back to you, Luma. She never gave up, but threats and fear kept her away. She lived in hiding, constantly moving from town." Jean stepped closer, examining the photos. They were pictures of Rosanna over the years, always looking over her shoulder, as if afraid of discovery. "My God," he murmured, "what have we done to her?" Alex continued. "About 5 years ago, Rosanna finally gathered the courage to return to the city. She was determined to get Luma back and expose the truth. But then..." He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. "Then what?" Mrs. Laura asked, her voice shaking. "She disappeared," Alex said finally. "The day before she came here, Rosanna simply vanished, without a trace." The shock of the revelation swept through the room like a wave. Luma fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Jean immediately knelt beside her, hugging her protectively. "That doesn't make sense," Clara said, her voice thick with guilt. "She came to me. She asked for help. If I had..." "Don't blame yourself," Alex interrupted her gently. "There's more to this story than meets the eye. During my investigation, I discovered something disturbing. Someone was following Rosanna, someone powerful and resourceful. Everyone in the room held their breath, anticipating what was coming next. I found evidence that a major figure in the business world was involved in Rosanna's disappearance. Someone who had a lot to lose if the truth came out." Jean stood up abruptly. Who? Who did this to her?" Alex hesitated for a moment before answering. "Charles." The name fell like a bombshell in the room. Charles was one of the biggest businessmen in the country, known for his political connections and his influence in the business world. "But why?" Mrs. Laura asked, confused. "What would Charles have to do with all this?" Jean, however, began to put the pieces together. "He was my father's business partner. If the scandal came to light, it wouldn't just be Dad's reputation that would be at stake. Charles's business would be affected too." Alex nodded. "Exactly. And there's more. I found evidence that Charles was involved in illegal business dealings with his father, John, money laundering, tax fraud. Rosanna knew too much. She was a threat not only to their reputation, but to the entire empire they had built. The room fell silent as everyone processed this new information. Jean's father, who had already fallen from his pedestal in his son's eyes, was now revealed to be even more corrupt than they had imagined. Luma, who had calmed down a bit, looked at Alex with determination. "My mother. Do you think she's still alive?" The question hung in the air, heavy and laden with hope and fear. Alex looked into the girl's eyes. "I'm not sure, Luma, but I haven't found any concrete evidence that she isn't, and as long as there's a chance, no matter how small, we can't give up." Jean walked over to Luma, placing his hand on her shoulder. "We will find her, Luma, I promise you. No matter what it takes, we will find the truth and bring justice." Mrs. Laura, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke. I have something to confess, something that might help." All eyes turned to her. "Before he died, your father gave me a box. He said it was his secret inheritance, something that could change everything. I never had the courage to open it." Jean looked at his mother in disbelief. "Where is that box, Mom?" "In the attic," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hidden behind the old dresser." Without hesitation, Jean ran to the attic, closely followed by Luma and Alex. When they returned, they were carrying a rusty metal box. With trembling hands, Jean opened the box. Inside, they found documents, old photos, and a flash drive. "This," Alex said, taking the flash drive, "could be the key to unraveling the whole mystery." As Jean plugged the flash drive into her laptop, the tension in the room was palpable. Whatever was on that little device could change their lives forever. The computer screen lit up, revealing a series of files. Jean clicked on the first one, and her father's voice, recorded shortly before his death, filled the room. "Jean, my son, if you are hearing this, it means the moment of truth has come. There is much I need to confess." The chapter of truth was about to be revealed, and with it, Rosanna's fate and the future of the entire family hung in the balance. Antonio's deep, tired voice filled the room, emanating from Jean's laptop. Everyone was in absolute silence, absorbing each word with a mixture of anxiety and apprehension. "Jean, my son, if you are hearing this, it means the moment of truth has come. There is much I need to confess, and I know my words could change the way you see me forever. But I cannot leave this world carrying the weight of these secrets." John felt a lump form in his throat. Beside him, Luma held his hand tightly, her eyes fixed on the computer screen. "It all started over 20 years ago," Antonio's voice continued. "I was an ambitious man, blinded by power and greed. When I met Rosanna, something changed in me. She was light, purity, everything I was not. Our relationship was wrong from the beginning, I knew it, but I couldn't resist it." Mrs. Laura sobbed. Softly, the memories of that time clearly painful. "When Rosanna got pregnant, I panicked. My reputation, my business, everything was at risk. I did terrible things, son, things that I deeply regret. I threatened Rosanna. I offered her money to make her disappear, but she was strong, determined. She wanted me to take responsibility for the child, for us to form a family." Luma trembled as she heard these words, silent tears streaming down her face. "But I was a coward, and I was not alone in my cowardice. Charles, my business partner and supposed friend, convinced me that we needed to resolve the situation. He was afraid that the scandal would affect our business dealings, much of which, I admit with shame, were not exactly legal." Jean clenched his fists, anger bubbling in his chest. "We used our influence to force Rosanna to leave. We threatened her family, her friends. She left, taking Luma with her. And for years I tried to convince myself that I had done the right thing, but the guilt never left me." The recording paused and Antonio could be heard breathing heavily. 5 years ago, Rosanna came back. She wanted justice, she wanted the truth to come out. I was ready to confess everything, to try to fix what had been broken. But Charles had other plans. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone held their breath, anticipating what would come next. He hired people to follow Rosanna, to threaten her again, And then she disappeared. John, my son, I fear that Charles has done something terrible, something unforgivable. Luma let out a muffled groan, burying her face in Jean's shoulder. I have no concrete evidence, but in the files on this flash drive, you will find all the information I have been able to gather. Suspicious transactions, encrypted emails, locations that may be relevant. Use this, John. Find Rosanna, seek justice, and above all, protect Luma. She is your sister, blood of my blood. Take care of her as I should have. Antonio's voice trembled, filled with emotion. I know that asking for forgiveness is a lot, maybe even too much, but I hope that one day when the whole truth comes out, you will be able to understand, if not forgive, the terrible choices I made. I love you, my son. And I love you too, Luma, even if I never had the courage to say it to you in person. Goodbye. The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in the room. For several minutes, no one moved or spoke, each person absorbing the impact of the revelations. Jean was the first to recover. With determination in his eyes, he began to search through the other files on the flash drive. There has to be something here, he muttered. Some clue to Rosanna's whereabouts. Alex stepped closer, his investigator's instincts heightened. Let me help. I know people who can analyze this data, find patterns we might not be able to see. While Jean and Alex were leaning over the computer, Mrs. Laura approached Luma, who remained motionless, staring into space. Honey, Mrs. Laura said softly, I know that nothing I say can fix what we've done, but I want you to know that from now on, I will do everything in my power to help find your mother and bring justice. Luma looked at the old lady, her eyes filled with conflicting emotions. Why? She asked simply. Why did you do this to us? Mrs. Laura felt the weight of that question on her soul. Fear, my dear, fear and pride. We thought we were protecting our family, our reputation, but in the end, we only caused more pain and suffering. If I could go back... His words were interrupted by an exclamation from Jean. I found something, geographic coordinates and... A series of emails exchanged between Dad and someone with the code name Phoenix. Alex leaned over the computer, his eyes quickly scanning the information. That's interesting. The coordinates point to a rural property on the outskirts of town. And these emails, they seem to indicate that Phoenix was helping your father monitor Charles's movements. Jean looked at Luma, a flame of hope igniting in his eyes. Do you think it could be... Luma completed the thought. My mother. Do you think she could be alive, hiding in this place? Alex nodded slowly. It's a possibility. Your father may have arranged a safe hiding place for Rosanna, away from Charles's threats. So what are we waiting for? Jean stood up, determined. We need to get there, right now. But Alex held up his hand, urging caution. We can't just barge in. If Rosanna really is there, she might be scared, suspicious. And if Charles is monitoring the property, we could put her in danger. What do you suggest then? Luma asked, her voice shaking with anxiety. Alex thought for a moment. We need a plan. I'll contact some trusted colleagues, people who can help us approach this safely. In the meantime, Jean, you need to prepare yourself. If Charles really is involved in this, we're dealing with a powerful and dangerous man. Jean nodded, determination evident on his face. I'll do whatever it takes, for Luma, for Rosanna, and to finally get justice. As the group began to plot their next steps, the storm outside finally began to subside. A ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the room. It was as if the universe itself was signaling that after years of darkness and secrecy, the light of truth was finally about to shine. The path ahead would be perilous and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Hope of reuniting a long-sundered family, of righting past wrongs, and of confronting the shadows that had for so long dominated their lives. Luma looked out the window at the lightening sky. Hang in there, Mom, she whispered. We're almost there. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity in the house. John, with Alex's help, delved deep into the information contained on the flash drive, searching for any additional clues that could lead to Rosanna's whereabouts. Luma, alternating between moments of hope and anxiety, never left her newly discovered brother's side. Mrs. Laura, consumed by guilt, spent hours in her room, going through old boxes and albums, looking for any detail she might have forgotten, any information that might help. Clara, in turn, used her contacts in the community to try to obtain information about suspicious movements in the area indicated by the coordinates. It was on a sunny afternoon, 5 days after the revelations, that Alex arrived with news. "I've got information on the property," he announced, spreading maps and photographs across the living room table. "It's an old farmhouse, apparently abandoned for years, but..." He paused dramatically. "There's evidence of recent activity. Supply deliveries, vehicle movement." John pored over the photos, his eyes hungry for details. "That means someone is there. It could be her, it could be mine, our mother." Luma, who had been silent, finally spoke. "What if it isn't? What if it's a trap?" The silence that followed was heavy. Alex was the first to break it. "That's why we need to be cautious. We can't just storm the place, we need a plan." "What is your suggestion?" John asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Alex took a deep breath before answering. "I have a contact, an ex-cop named Michael. He can help us do a discreet reconnaissance of the area. If we confirm Rosanna's presence, or any suspicious activity, we can take action." "What about Charles?" Mrs. Laura asked, concern evident in her voice. "If he finds out what we're doing..." "I've thought about that," Alex replied. "We need a distraction, something to keep Charles occupied while we investigate." "The farm," Jean frowned thoughtfully. Maybe we can use the press, leak some information about his illegal activities without mentioning Rosanna or Luma. It would keep him busy trying to control the damage." "It's risky," Clara warned, "but it might work." The following days were spent in intense preparation. Jean, using his business contacts, began to spread rumors about irregularities in Charles's companies. Alex and Michael made preliminary reconnaissance of the farm, mapping entrances, exits, and possible observation points. Luma, unable to sit still, insisted on helping. She spent hours studying photos of the farm, memorizing every detail, every path, every building. "If my mother is there," she said with determination, "I want to be able to find her." Tensions grew with each passing day. News about Charles began to circulate in the media, causing a stir in business circles. As expected, he was busy trying to contain the damage, giving interviews and making public statements. Finally, on a starry night, Alex gathered everyone in the living room. "It's time," he announced. "Tomorrow at dawn, we will make our move." The plan was simple but risky. Jean, Alex, and Michael would approach the farm from different angles. Clara would stay at a strategic point, ready to raise the alarm if she noticed any suspicious movement. Mrs. Laura would remain at home in constant contact with a trusted lawyer, ready to call the authorities if necessary. As for Luma, the decision was difficult. She begged to go along, arguing that no one would recognize her mother better than she could. After much discussion, it was agreed that she would stay with Clara at a safe distance, but ready to approach if Rosanna was found. That night, no one could sleep well. Jean spent hours staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with possible scenarios. What if they found Rosanna? What if she didn't want to see them? What if it was too late? Luma, in her room, clutched tightly the locket her mother had left her years ago. "Please," she whispered into the silence of the night. "Please let her be okay. Let her want to see us." At dawn, the group gathered one last time before departing. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. "Remember," Alex said, his voice serious, "our priority is Rosanna's safety. If anything seems wrong, we retreat immediately. We can't risk putting her in danger." John nodded, hugging Luma tightly. "We'll get her back," he promised. "One way or another, we'll settle this today." As the sun rose over the horizon, dyeing the sky in golden and pink hues, the group set off towards the farm. Each person's heart was beating fast, a mixture of fear and hope pulsing in their chests. The moment of truth had arrived. Years of secrets, lies, and separation were about to come to an end. For better or worse, this day would change their lives forever. As they approached the farm, the air seemed to grow heavier. The surrounding nature was quiet, as if even the birds and insects felt the importance of the moment. Jean looked up. at the sky, a silent prayer on his lips. May we be prepared, he thought, for whatever we encounter. And so, with heavy but determined hearts, they moved forward into the unknown, ready to face whatever fate had in store for them. The farm loomed on the horizon like a ghost from the past, its weathered structures contrasting with the natural beauty around it. Jean, Alex, and Michael split up as planned, each approaching from a different angle. The tension was palpable. Every leaf that moved, every twig that crackled beneath their feet, seemed amplified in the morning silence. Jean, his heart pounding in his chest, cautiously advanced along the eastern side of the property. His eyes scanned every window, every door, searching for signs of life. It was then that he noticed one of the windows in the main house had freshly washed curtains, clashing with the abandoned appearance of the rest of the building. Over the radio, his voice a strained whisper, he communicated his discovery to the others. Someone's here, he concluded. Recent. Alex, who was approaching from the west, replied, Confirmed. There are fresh tire tracks near the barn. Someone has been here in the last 24 hours. Adrenaline ran through everyone's veins. They were so close to discovering the truth. Meanwhile, at a safe distance, Luma and Clara watched through binoculars, the tension evident on their faces. Luma clutched her mother's locket so tightly that her knuckles were white. What if she doesn't want to see me? Luma whispered, giving voice to the fear that had been consuming her for days. Clara placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Your mother loves you, Luma. She spent years trying to get back to you. Have faith. Back at the farm, Michael, who was approaching from the north, suddenly froze. Over the radio, his urgent voice cut through the silence. Movement in the main house. I repeat, there is movement in the main house. John felt his heart skip a beat. It was happening. After so much time, so many secrets, they were finally about to find out the truth. Cautiously, the three men converged on the entrance of the house. Jean, taking the lead, took a deep breath and knocked on the door. The sound echoed ominously in the morning silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, almost painfully, the door began to open. Time seemed to freeze. Jean held his breath, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. And then, there she was. Rosanna, older, with grey in her hair and worry lines. On her face, but unmistakable. Her eyes, the same eyes as Luma's, widened in shock and recognition. Jean? She whispered, her voice shaking. Is that really you? Jean felt tears well up in his eyes. Yes, Rosanna, it's me. We've come to take you home. For a moment, Rosanna seemed to hesitate, fear evident in her eyes. But then, as if a dam had broken, she threw herself into John's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. I thought I would never see anyone again, she cried. They told me it was dangerous, that I had to stay hidden. Jean hugged her tightly, his own tears now flowing freely. It's okay now. You're safe. And there's someone who's dying to see you. Hearing this, Rosanna pulled back, her eyes wide with hope and fear. Luma? Is my Luma here? As if answering her question, a scream cut through the air. Mother! Luma, unable to contain herself upon seeing Rosanna, had run towards the house, ignoring Clara's protests. What followed was a scene of pure, raw emotion. Mother and daughter met halfway, falling to their knees in the grass, holding each other and crying, years of separation and pain being washed away by tears of joy and relief. Jean, Alex, and Michael watched the scene, moved. It was a moment of triumph, of redemption, but the joy was short-lived. The sound of cars rapidly approaching shattered the moment. Alex, always alert, was the first to react. We have company, he warned, and it doesn't look friendly. 3 black SUVs appeared on the road, screeching to a halt at the farm's entrance. Out of the first vehicle stepped a figure John recognized immediately. Charles. Well, Charles said, his voice cold and calculating. What a touching family reunion. Too bad it has to end so soon. John stood protectively in front of Rosanna and Luma. It's over, Charles. We know everything. Your threats, your lies, there's no way to hide the truth anymore. Charles laughed, the sound humorless. Do you really think it's that simple, Jean? That you can just show up here and fix everything? There's a lot more at stake than you can imagine. The tension in the air was palpable. On one side, a newly reunited family, determined to protect what they had finally found. On the other, a powerful man, willing to do anything to keep his secrets buried. The final confrontation was about to begin, and at that moment, as the wind blew across the farm fields, no one knew for sure how this story would end. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The air was thick with tension as the two groups faced each other. On one side, Jean, Rosanna, Luma and their allies. On the other, Charles and his men, their expressions hard and threatening. "You don't understand what's at stake here, Jean," Charles said, his voice cold as ice. "There are bigger things than your little family reunion." Jean stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "What could be greater than the truth, Charles? Than justice for a family destroyed by lies and greed?" Charles laughed, the sound humorless. "Politics, my dear. Money. Power. The gears that really move this country. Your father understood that. Why do you think he kept Rosanna hidden all these years?" Rosanna, still hugging Luma, spoke for the first time, her voice shaky but determined. "He was protecting me. From you, Charles. Antonio finally understood the monster you are." "Such protecting," Charles scoffed. "He was protecting himself, my dear. The documents you had, the evidence, and they could bring down not just me, but an entire network of influence and power." Jean felt a shiver run down his spine. "What? Documents?" Rosanna looked at Jean, her eyes full of guilt and determination. I found out things, Jean, about your father's business, about Charles, about powerful politicians, corruption, money laundering, influence peddling. I threatened to expose everything if they didn't let me keep Luma. And that's why they forced you to flee," John concluded, the pieces finally falling into place. Charles applauded sarcastically. "Bravo, Sherlock. Now that we all understand the situation, how about we be reasonable? Hand over the documents, Rosanna, and we can all get on with our lives." "Never," Rosanna spat. "Those documents are the only thing that kept me alive all these years, the only guarantee that Luma would be safe." The tension in the air was palpable. Charles's men stepped forward, their hands dangerously close to the weapons in their holsters. It was then that an unexpected voice cut through the air. "Enough!" Everyone turned to see Mrs. Laura emerging from one of the parked cars in the distance. She walked with difficulty, leaning on a cane, but her eyes shone with fierce determination. "Mom?" Jan exclaimed, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Laura ignored her son, her eyes fixed on Charles. "It's over, Charles. I won't be silent any longer." Charles frowned, clearly disturbed by the unexpected presence. "Laura, dear, you don't know what you're talking about. Go home. Let the men sort this out." "Men?" Mrs. Laura laughed bitterly. "The same men who destroyed families, who lied and cheated for years. No, Charles, enough lies." She turned to Jean, Rosanna and Luma. I knew everything from the beginning. The dirty dealings, the threats, everything. And I kept quiet, thinking I was protecting our family. But now I see that I only caused more pain." Tears streamed down Mrs. Laura's wrinkled face. "Forgive me, all of you. I should have been stronger, should have done the right thing a long time ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles, for the first time, looked truly shaken. "Laura, you can't." "I can and I will," she interrupted him. From her purse, she withdrew an envelope. "Here are copies of all the documents, bank records, emails, illegal contracts, everything." Jean looked at his mother, a mixture of shock and awe on his face. "Mom, how—" "Your father told me everything before he died," she explained. "He made me promise that I would only use this information if it was absolutely necessary. And now it is." Charles, seeing his empire crumble before his eyes, made a sharp gesture to his men. "Get that envelope, now!" Chaos ensued. Alex and Michael sprang into action, placing themselves protectively in front of Mrs. Laura. Jean pulled Rosanna and Luma back, his body serving as a shield. But before any violence could erupt, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Police cars appeared on the road surrounding the property. "Federal police, everyone stop!" Charles looked around desperately, searching for an escape route. But he was surrounded. His men, seeing the situation, lowered their weapons, surrendering. As the police moved in, handcuffing Charles and his henchmen, Jean turned to his family. Rosanna and Luma were hugging each other, tears of relief on their faces. Mrs. Laura, exhausted but triumphant, smiled softly. "It's over," Jean whispered, barely believing it. "It's really over." The hours that followed were a whirlwind of testimonies, statements and explanations. But amid the chaos, one thing became clear. The truth had finally come out. As the sun set on the farm that had kept its secrets for so long, a renewed family came together. There was much to be said, much to be forgiven, much to be rebuilt. But for the first time in years, there was also hope. Jean looked at Luma, at Rosanna, at his mother. Despite everything, despite the pain and the lies, they were there, together. "Let's go home," he said softly. And in that moment, everyone understood. That home was not just a place, but the sense of belonging they had finally found in each other. As they left the farm, the weight of the secrets finally lifting, they all knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, there would be difficult times. But they would face it all together, as the family they were always meant to be. And so, under the starry sky of a night that marked the end of an era of lies and the beginning of a new journey of truth and redemption, they set out, united, strengthened, and finally, complete. The months that followed the dramatic revelation at the farm were ones of intense transformation for the family. The mansion, once a symbol of secrecy and isolation, became a vibrant home full of voices, laughter, and occasionally heated arguments. The truth, while liberating, brought with it challenges that no one was fully prepared to face. Rosanna and Luma moved into the house, occupying a wing that Jean had renovated especially for them. The first few days were marked by a mixture of euphoria and discomfort. Years of separation could not be erased overnight, and both mother and daughter struggled to find their place in this new family dynamic. Luma, in particular, oscillated between moments of profound joy at having her mother back and outbursts of rage at the childhood that had been stolen from her. There were nights when her screams echoed through the halls of the mansion, accusations and tears mixing in a torrent of pent-up emotions. "Why didn't you fight harder?" she cried out to Rosanna one of those nights. "Why did you leave me alone for so long?" Rosanna, heartbroken, tried to explain the dangers, the threats, the constant fear that had consumed her for years. But for a teenager who grew up on the streets, these explanations seemed insufficient. Jean, watching these interactions, felt torn. Part of him wanted to intervene, to offer comfort, but another part knew that mother and daughter needed to weather these emotional storms alone to truly reconnect. Mrs. Laura, meanwhile, carried the weight of guilt. Although her final act of courage had been crucial in dismantling Charles's corrupt empire, the years of silence and complicity weighed heavily on her conscience. She spent long periods in her room, leafing through old family albums, as if searching for answers in the past. It was on one of those melancholic afternoons that Luma unexpectedly knocked on Mrs. Laura's door. "Can I come in?" the girl asked, her voice uncharacteristically shy. Mrs. Laura, surprised, nodded. "Of course, dear. Come in." Luma sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes wandering over the scattered portraits. "Are these pictures of my father?" she asked hesitantly. Mrs. Laura felt a lump in her throat. "Yes. Do you want to see some?" The two spent the afternoon like this, Mrs. Laura sharing stories, some funny, some painful, about the man who connected their lives in such complex ways. It was a healing moment for both of them, a small step toward forgiveness and mutual understanding. Meanwhile, Jean was facing challenges of his own. With Charles's downfall, many of the family's businesses were under scrutiny. He spent endless days in meetings with lawyers, auditors, and investigators, determined to clear the company's name and rebuild it on an ethical foundation. One night, exhausted after another tiring day, Jean found Rosanna on the balcony, looking at the stars. "How are you dealing with all this?" he asked, joining her. Rosanna smiled sadly. "Sometimes it feels like a dream. Other times, a nightmare. Having Luma back is indescribable. But there are times when I feel like I'm a stranger. In her life, Jean placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Give it time, you've both been through a lot. Reconnecting doesn't happen overnight. Rosanna nodded, grateful for the support. And you, Jean? How are you feeling about all this? Finding out that you have a sister, that your father... She didn't finish her sentence, but there was no need. Jean understood. It's complicated, he admitted. There are days when I look at pictures of my father and don't recognize the man I see. Other days when I remember the good times and wonder how he could be capable of so much love and so much cruelty. The two were silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. You know, Jean finally said, despite everything, I'm glad. The truth is out. It's painful, but it's liberating. Rosanna smiled, a genuine smile this time. Me too. And I'm grateful for you, Jean, for taking us in, for fighting for us. At that moment, Luma appeared on the balcony, her eyes still red from crying but with a small smile on her lips. Hey, she said softly, can I join you? Jean and Rosanna made room, and the three of them stood there, watching the stars, a small moment of peace amidst the emotional storm that still surrounded them. Inside the house, Mrs. Laura watched the scene through the window, her heart filling with a mixture of sadness and hope. She knew the road ahead would still be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, she felt like everyone was heading in the right direction. As the night wore on, the mansion, once a monument to secrets and lies, seemed to breathe new air. The wounds were still raw, the scars were still visible, but there was also a sense of possibility, of a new beginning. The truth had come at a high price, but it had brought with it the chance to build something new, something genuine. And as the family prepared to face the challenges that lay ahead, there was a quiet certainty that together they would find their way to healing and a brighter future. A year had passed since the dramatic events at the farm. The mansion, once a symbol of secrecy and isolation, now pulsed with renewed energy. The walls that had once muffled whispers of lies now echoed. With laughter and open conversation, it was a Sunday morning, and the family was gathered in the garden for brunch. Jean, wearing an apron that said, "World's Best Chef, Brother," a playful gift from Luma, was at the grill, making pancakes. Rosanna and Mrs. Laura were setting the table, exchanging recipes and stories with a familiarity that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Luma, now 17, arrived carrying a stack of books. Her hair, once messy, was pulled back into an elaborate braid, and her eyes shone with a mixture of determination and hope. "I managed to finish all my studying for the entrance exams," she announced, setting her books on a chair. "I think I have a real chance of getting into law school next semester." Jean smiled proudly. "I have no doubt about that, little sister. You are the most determined person I know." Rosanna came closer, hugging her daughter with tears in her eyes. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you, dear." The mention of Luma's grandmother brought a moment of reflective silence. In the month since the family reunion, they had managed to trace Rosanna's history, discovering that her mother had passed away years earlier, never knowing what really happened to her daughter. "She knows," Luma said softly. "Wherever she is, she knows we're okay now." Mrs. Laura, who was watching the scene, felt a wave of emotion run through her. Even after a year, there were times when she could hardly believe the transformation everyone had undergone. "Come, come," she called, her voice shaky but full of affection. "The food will get cold." As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed naturally, touching on a variety of topics. Jean spoke about the progress the company had made, which now operated with complete transparency and had become a model of business ethics. "There are still challenges," he admitted. "Some customers still look at us with suspicion because of the past. But we are building something new, something we can be proud of." Rosanna, who now worked as a counselor at an organization supporting women who have been victims of violence, shared some stories of overcoming that she had witnessed. "Sometimes, when I listen to these women, I see myself," she said. "And I realize how much I've grown, how much we've all grown." Luma, between bites of pancakes, talked about her plans for the future. I want to use the law to help people like us, you know? Families torn apart by lies and manipulation, maybe even work with homeless children. You'll be amazing at this, Jean said, squeezing her sister's shoulder affectionately. Ms. Laura, who had spent much of the year dealing with her guilt through therapy, finally found the courage to share something she had been planning. I've been thinking, she began, her voice a little hesitant. I'd like to use part of the inheritance to create a foundation, something that can help families reunite, that can provide legal and emotional support for people in situations like the one we're in. The proposal was received with enthusiasm by everyone. It was another step towards healing, a way to transform the pain of the past into something positive for the future. As the meal drew to a close and the conversation became more reflective, Jean raised her glass of juice. I'd like to make a toast, he said, his voice thick with emotion. To the truth, no matter how painful it was, to the courage that allowed us to face our fears and our secrets, and most of all, to family. Not the family we thought we were, but the family we discovered we are. Everyone raised their glasses, their eyes shining with unshed tears. The clink of the toast echoed through the garden, carrying with it the promise of a future built on honesty and love. After brunch, while everyone helped clean up, Luma pulled Jean aside. You know, she said, her voice low and sincere, a year ago, I didn't know what it was like to have a family. Now I can't imagine my life without you guys. Jean hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of the unspoken words, of the love that had grown between them. From a distance, Rosanna and Mrs. Laura watched the scene, exchanging looks of mutual understanding. The path that brought them here was long and painful, but the result was more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. As the day wore on, the family spread out around the house, each seeking a moment of quiet. But there was a peace in their separation, a comfort in the knowledge that no matter where they were united by bonds stronger than blood or secrets. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. On the balcony, Jean found Luma staring thoughtfully at the horizon. What are you thinking about? He asked softly. Luma smiled, a smile full of hope and possibility. In the future, she replied, in all that we can be, in all that we can do. Jean nodded, understanding perfectly. They had weathered the storm, faced their demons, and emerged stronger on the other side. The future, with all its challenges and promises, awaited. And there, on that balcony, watching the sun set over a new chapter in their lives, Jean and Luma felt a deep certainty. No matter what tomorrow brought, they would face it together, as a family, as it always should have been,